Hello, my name is Husam Eldin Haroon. I am an environmental activist and a student here at Penn State University studying energy sustainability and policy. Welcome to my podcast where we talk about everything climate change, energy, and everything sustainability. Today is Monday, August 3rd, 2050. Climate change is an ongoing catastrophe that continues to threaten our planet. Our CO2 emissions continue to accelerate climate change, leading to drastic planet warming and extreme weather events. Sea levels continue to rise, floods are forcing thousands to evacuate, and the International Government Panel on Climate Change and the NOAA showed that global oceans have risen by 0.5 to a foot over the last 10 years, despite the many efforts to address climate change. Warming has also intensified strain in a lot of communities across the globe. Supercharged ocean temperatures are becoming more problematic. Oceans are getting hotter and hotter and acting as an octane fuel for tropical storms, leading to rapid intensifications and higher peak wind speeds. In other news, though, we have made a lot of progress in terms of energy transition. Solar and energy and nuclear are making huge progress towards powering our company and helping us inch closer towards 100% clean energy. Solar energy organizations like the International Energy Agency estimate that wind and solar combined have accounted for nearly 70% of total electricity generations over the last year under the net zero pathway. Um, Also, here in the U.S., the Department of Energy has outlined that solar has expanded to generate nearly 52% of all U.S. electricity. We've made a lot of progress in terms of energy transition and fighting climate over the last few decades, and today we are going to gauge just how far we've come. First, let's look back at some of the key earliest efforts to address climate change. The earliest efforts to address climate change began with the fundamental scientific discoveries of the 19th century, which eventually evolved into global political treaties by the 20th century. In 1824, the greenhouse effect identified French mathematic. The greenhouse was first identified. French mathematician Joseph Fourier proposed that the Earth's atmosphere traps heat like a glass vessel. Going further, first time we found a CO2 link. It was an American scientist by the name Uriens Newtonfoot. He was conducted an experiment proving that the atmosphere, heavy with carbon dioxide gas, traps immense heat. In 1896, the first global warming prediction was created. Swedish chemist Svante Arrhenius published the first calculation showing that burning fossil fuels could double the atmospheric and drastic warming of the planet. Now, let's look at some of the earliest efforts to actually address climate change and fight back. For me, the Paris Agreement of 2015 and the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 act as an important pivot for energy transition. Evaluating the Paris Agreement and the Inflation Act through the core valuables, especially climate impacts, social equity, economic dynamics, reveals a stark contrast between what these policies originally intended and how they played an important role to bring us important legislation like the one big beautiful act. The Paris Agreement was the first universal directive, meaning that it was the first joint global effort by countries all over the world to agree to limit their CO2 emissions. Um, Paris replaced the Paris replaced the fractured climate diplomacy of the 20th century. It created a permanent, legal, recognizable North Star, limiting warming to just 1.5 C and establishing the ratchet mechanism, forcing countries to continually increase their goals. The Inflation Reduction Act as the market ignition. The IRA was the single largest climate investment in U.S. history. It transformed climate policy from a system of regulatory punishment into a system of massive economic rewards, even amid intense domestic political turbulence, such as subsequent passage on the One Big Beautiful compressing its tax time credit timeline. The IRA structurally drove down the global cost of clean energy technologies. Now, looking at the data charts, we find a kick in global emissions curve. We see that the Paris Agreement and the IRA initially initiated green technology boom. The subsequent political whiplash displayed peak global emission reduction, pushing the planet past 1.5 C through outlined in Paris. So what happened? We had countries leaving the agreement, like the U.S. back in 2026, under the Trump administration. They decided that they weren't going to be a part of the agreement anymore, and this led to a lot of backlash and a lot of negative consequences. The U.S. was one of the key members of the agreement, meaning that they were responsible for a good amount of the funding and the budgeting that went into these projects. The Paris Agreement was built on a voluntary pledge with zero enforcement teeth, meaning that a country can just leave, a country can miss its targets, and there were no penalties. However, uh, however, global trade blocs began imposing steep tariffs on imports from high emission countries, meaning that their kickback was that if they weren't going to contribute towards a climate effort, that they were going to suffer financially. This turns climate policy into a weapon, moving past the voluntary teamwork model of the Paris, meaning countries began acting very, very individualistic and in self-interest. A shift in technology strategy. The IRA heavily prioritized subsidizing mature technologies like solar panel and wind power. However, the domestic political landscape has proven high volatility. Legislation like the One Big phased out those core wind, solar, electric incentive, pivoting the grid towards alternative energies.